Let me begin, as we always do, with the preliminaries by thanking Shomer and Muna for hosting ours as a series. Next week is the last one, so they've been kind enough to host us all the way through. So thank you very much. I want to thank the Lehman family, as always, once again, for sponsoring us all the way through. Tonight, you see, thank you, appreciate it. And tonight, you see, our sponsors are the Jacobsons over here. Are they here yet? I'm sure they'll be here soon. Bela and Murray. It's the Grillies in honor of their grandchildren, Ken Yerbu, okay, I support that statement. And the Radowskis, who are here virtually. Not everybody's still comfortable about the corona, and I respect that. I seriously do. I just hope, obviously, by the time we get to the next series or whatever, oh Lord, we should be past that. But who knows? We've all learned in the last 2 years to make no prognostications, right? And anyway, the Russians or the Chinese might unleash something new. Who the heck knows? Okay. So once again, I want to thank the tech team. Some are here, some are remote. And without any further ado, let's get down to work. Little did I know that Putin would have the chutzpah to invade right in the middle of my week on Thursday, and so completely put aside anything I wanted to say, but I'm going to have no choice but to proceed as if the whole thing never happened. The name of our series, as always, is The Last Years Before Oslo, the State of Israel and the Jewish People, 1988 to 1992. Tonight is the 15th lecture, 15 out of 16. So next week is the end. And whatever the original title was, by the time as I told you once, I write these titles up a long time ago. But when I got down to put it all together, so I ended up writing about thoughts about some aspects of diaspora Jewry in the late 20th century. And by the time I really put this together, it's mostly about French Jewry. It'll be one piece of the diaspora. I've done that before to focus on one or two. As we'll see, the French Jewry for a reason. Very briefly, it's the third largest Jewish community. I don't think most of us realize that. If you live in America and all this, we're not used to thinking in those terms. But the French Jewish community is the third largest. So let me get down to brass tacks and begin. The conditions of diaspora Jewry have certainly changed in the last 3 or 4 decades, which is actually a truism in Jewish history, diaspora-wise. In certain places and certain times in our history, things were good for the Jews, at other times, not good, the opposite. In the very same places. This is more or less a defining feature of Gullus. So, 1840 was okay to be in Germany, 1940 was not, like that. Long ago, Poland was a much better place for Jews than Germany or France. And then things changed. So it depends what century, what time. It's always moving like a chess game. Long ago, the Jews had it better under Islam than they had under Christendom, right? But that has changed. And so all we can do is agree with Lord Palmerston, who says, that we don't necessarily have permanent friends, but we do have permanent interests. So in those of you Jewish, you're always judging the diaspora situation, obviously, based on, is it okay for the Jews here and now or not? Okay? I might add, right now people are having mixed feelings on the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, which took place 2 days ago. And I'm hearing from all kinds of people. Some say pro-Ukraine, others say, oh, the Ukrainians killed the Jews back in, long ago and so forth. And basically all of Europe is like that. Okay? I mean, the English massacred the Jews, if you want to get down to it, in the time of Richard the Lionhearted. So it's, kind of complex. That's my point. Those Jews with a sense of history and with a traditionalist feeling of Gullus were not surprised. So our ancestors long ago, because of their very traditionalist way of thinking about life, and they see the hand of God in things, so basically they rolled with the punches. So if you told them, oh, things are bad over here, yeah, it's bad. If they kick you out, they kick you out, move to another country. If there was a riot or a pogrom, it was terrible. And the day after, they picked up where they left off. I don't know if you think about that. People lived in a country, in a town where some terrible things happened. It's not the case that when the pogrom or whatever you call it was over, everybody ran away. That's what happened after the Holocaust, because they had no choice. But back once upon a time, you reopened your store, you repaired your windows, life went back to normal, and you served the same customers that murdered your family a week ago. This is how it was long ago. And anyway, they never got so, I'm talking about from Jews from long ago, before the 19th century. They never got so hooked up with the country in which they resided as to say, oh my, I feel the loss of that great land that was here once before. I don't exactly think, the Satmar Rebbe says, oh, I've lost Romania, the beautiful land of yesteryear. You understand? He said, I was in Gullus and Hungary, down with Romania, and the hell with all of them, like that. You see? Now, on the other hand, there are exceptions to what I said. There have been Jewish communities who regarded themselves, as they say in the South, as native to the soil. And that would be people like the Abarbanel and others when they were kicked out of Spain. He said, oh, this can't be. And if you read the writings of Abarbanel, especially his commentaries in the book of Daniel and places like that, oh, it can't be. We are so part of Spain. This can only be explained that it's Mashiach's side. And he was absolutely convinced that the expulsion of Jews in Spain in 1492, rather than being a logical consequence of various historical trends, which in retrospect should have been pretty evident, was just an act of God, which can only be associated with the end times. You see? Because the Jews in Spain really got hooked into that sort of thing. So those kind of Jews suffered shock and existential angst when they were expelled. But not others. In the last 2 centuries, and only then, since around 1800, it was demanded of Jews in Europe that they feel an emotional attachment to the lands of Gullus in which they happen to reside, if they wanted to be granted citizenship. You want to be a German citizen, a French citizen, all the rest of it, you got to be German, you got to be French. You have to feel it over here in the Kishkas, okay? Which makes sense. I mean, you can understand. You want full access to rights, you got to feel like the people who are not Jewish, they feel 100% connected with the country, like this guy now in Ukraine, who feels 100% connected to Ukraine. Right? He's willing to give up his life, it looks to me. You see? Now, but this patriotism that I just described clashed with the traditional idea that a Yid is supposed to feel that he's in Gullus. Okay? And so, you're supposed to feel like Yehuda Levi, who said, I'm in the east and I'm in the west, my heart is in the east. Remember that? Libi b'mizrach anochi b'zof ma'arov. How can I taste anything? How can I fulfill anything when I see Zion trapped and subjugated? It's easy to leave all the good of Spain, right, just to lick the dust of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, I mean, that's make Yehuda Levi. That's the old-fashioned way, you see? But now, a person's like this, Ukraine above all, or France above all, or Bulgaria above all. This was the new feeling demanded in the modern era of the Jews. The only country that didn't actually make a demand like that in form of a demand was the USA, as far as I know, where George Washington famously said in his letter that many are familiar with, that the government of the United States requires only, I repeat, only, that those who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens and giving in all occasions their effectual support. Okay? So in other words, you don't act against America, you obey the laws, you're like that, and that's all the demands they make of you. Okay? They didn't say, oh, you have to feel this or that and the other, which they certainly did in the other countries. Although, as I pointed out last week, American civil religion has proved very powerful, a kind of undertow, actually, that has dragged so much of American Jews out of Yiddishkeit. That's what last time. But this whole notion that I say that America has made minimal demands on people coming to become citizens there, that's what we call American exceptionalism. It what makes America different than other countries, and I believe that's something that most people cherish. Right? We like that about America. It's something unusual and special about this country. Even the culturally insular Haredi Yeshiva world, in my lifetime, started calling America Hamalchus Shel Chesed. You heard that expression, right? The kingdom of Chesed. It's just interesting how it kind of penetrated there. Anyway, experience indicates or teaches that an over-identification with the local nationalism, A, weakens Jewish identity and B, leads to eventual disappointment. So you see in front of you Kaiser Wilhelm and then Hitler. I think some of you may be related, or you certainly have heard, back in the time of Kaiser Wilhelm, boy, were the Jews patriotic. How many Jews? I bet you there are people here that have relatives that had medals from the German army for heroism in the First World War, or were proud of people that, fell in the service of the fatherland and all, and they really meant it. You understand? They really meant it. So, including, by the way, from Jews, it is possible, but usually it resulted in weakening Jewish identity, and B, it is in history, this has always led eventually to disappointment, because then you get Hitler. So in other words, somebody got badly wounded or mauled. Fighting for Germany in 1918 felt like a sap in 1938. He said, this is what I gave my life, my limbs for, okay? This Germany. And that's just one example. It's just a dramatic example. Now to modern times. As I said, conditions in the diaspora changed in the last 3 or 4 decades. In 1980, one would have said a Jew was more safe in Paris than in Moscow in 1980, because it was dangerous to be a Jew in Soviet Russia. Today, it's the opposite. It's actually, you're safer walking, if you're Jewish and you wear a yarmulke, you're actually safer walking, even in the middle of the war, you're actually safer walking the streets of Moscow than you are walking with a yarmulke in the streets of Paris. It's crazy. You understand? And so, it's not only the rabbi goes around looking like that. Right? Now, let's take a look at some statistics. In the 80s, how does the Jewish population work out? You had USA, Europe, Israel. USA had 6 million, Europe 2.5 million, Israel 3.7. Okay? Israel, in other words, had moved in about approximately 40 years from 650 to 3.7 million. It's about it multiplied 6 times. I'm talking about the Jewish population, right? Roughly. It's about six times as much. But Europe had 2.5 million, which is a lot, okay? 2.5 million out of the total Jewish people of the world. Because other than this, it's 6, and how much is that altogether? It's 8.5, and it's 11.5, and it's 12.2, right? So 12.2, and give it another million or so around the world. Where else is the other million? A little here, a little there, approximately. So you're looking at, that's the real numbers. Approximately 13 million Jews. You hear these other fuzzy math. But that's more or less what it is. 13 something, whatever. Which is not a lot after the Holocaust, but there you have it. Now, the bottom line I'm trying to share with you is there were 3 clusters: America, Israel, and Europe. Now, look how things have changed somewhat today. The latest figures, Israel's gone from 3.7, almost doubled to 6.3. America has gone really, really down from 6 point something to more like 5.7. And Europe has lost 1.5 million. Because it was 2.5, and now it's 1 million. So that's it. So little by little, over a broad period of time, I'm trying to indicate to you that the Jews are leaving Europe, or Europe is kicking them out, or whatever you want to call it. That is my point, okay? That's my point. Now, so let's take a look at Europe. The poster boy for this variance, and which is the theme I want to speak about tonight, the poster boy for this variance in the situation of diaspora Jewry is France, which, boy, is that a complicated story. Once upon a time, France was viewed by the Jews as a safe, democratic country. So many Jews moved there from Eastern Europe. Now, this was not exactly true. France has never really been a safe democracy, for example, like Britain, but Jews did not necessarily realize that. One of the features about Jews is they're stupid, you understand? It's not the only feature, but it's one of them. And sometimes a stupid decision leads to tragedy. And that was a story, as you know, in the 20th century of the Jews in France. Okay? Now, France has been very unstable, not like England or America, and therefore went through 11 changes of clothing in about 100 years or whatever. If you know a little bit, you don't have to know a lot, a little bit about your French history, you know, they used to have the king and the queen, then was the French Revolution, then the First Republic, then the Empire of Napoleon, then what they call the Bourbon Restoration when Napoleon fell. The Bourbon dynasty came in, then it was overthrown in the Republic in 1830 with the July monarchy, with the Orleanists. Then that was overthrown in 1848 and became the Second Republic. Then that was overthrown in 1852, Second Empire. That's Napoleon III. See what I mean? See what I mean? Then that fell in the war with Bismarck, and they started the Third Republic. Then the Vichy, we all know what that is. That's when they killed the Jews. That's the friends of Hitler. And then the Fourth Republic, and now they're holding by the Fifth Republic. Okay? So, like that. And that's where Jews moved. That's my point. Okay? That's why I say stupid. That's my point. Now, of all these, it is this one, the Third Republic. That's where all the Jews moved to in large numbers from Eastern Europe. Okay? That's just interesting. The Third Republic is the France that, as they say, was 1870 to 1940. I mean, like that. When they had Napoleon, I don't want to bore you, when they had Napoleon III, he lost the war to Prussia, so that fell apart, and what took its place was the Third Republic, that's the one that fought the First World War. That's where all the Jews from Russia and Poland and all these other places moved to, okay? The Third Republic. It had features which definitely affected the Jews. First of all, the Third Republic had a very polarized French polity, okay? There was a right wing that was very strong. But never strong enough to change the French laws regarding the Jews. One of the goals of the right wing in France was to take away the civil rights of the Jews. The story is crazy. When, as I say, the French Empire fell defeated by Bismarck, by Prussia, so the majority wanted to go back to have a king. And they actually want to go back to have this guy, who's from the Bourbon family, like from Marie Antoinette's time. You get it? And he would have been Henry V. But he said, I will only accept being king if he changed the flag from this back to the old royal flag. You get it? Which means he wanted to completely undo the French Revolution. That was a little too much even for them. You see? And so what they ended up saying was like this. The Third Republic is a b'di'evet, or as they refer to it over here, it divides us the least. If we go for the Bourbons, even the monarchists are divided between this is how life was. Do you want this chelik of the Bourbons, or do you want the Orleanists, which is another chelik of the Bourbons, or do you want the Bonapartes, you see? And then the Republican. If we have a republic, there's no king, and everybody's equally dissatisfied, and we get divided the least. So I'm trying to say like this, if you're Jewish, it's not necessarily the most stable situation to move to. The democratic left was always stronger than the non-democratic right in France, but the right was not weakened or marginalized, okay? So you had a strong right, but you also had a strong left. That's why Dreyfus eventually was vindicated, eventually. In the beginning, the right, as you know, railroaded him and put him on the Devil's Island. I'm sure everybody knows the story, right? They framed him. But eventually, Émile Zola and Georges Clemenceau, he's the newspaper publisher who published his attacks on the government for framing Dreyfus, okay? This is Zola. So eventually, it went out, not exactly, they never would come out and say made a mistake. They gave him a pardon, you see? So that reflects the fact the left wasn't, and then when I say the left, don't confuse this with the communist left or anything like this. This is the French left of the Third Republic, which was very capitalist and very middle class. They just didn't want the king and all this junk to come back and all these right-wing kooks, you understand? So, Clemenceau was not a socialist or anything like that at all. But I'm just trying to show you, this is not America, and it's not England. It's a country like that, okay? Now, it was volatile, and French politics could go in any direction, including the fact that they could even have a French prime minister. Okay, in the 1930s, you had Léon Blum, okay, who was leader of the socialists, and with a coalition of parties, and it seemed who was a French Jew. He went to the best schools and all that kind of stuff, but he's Jewish, okay. And don't you imagine Hitler didn't take advantage of that, okay? And many on the right in France said, better Hitler than Blum. I forget how you say it in French. It was a famous slogan. You get it? Now, subsequently, in the Second World War, you could have the Vichy government, which cooperated with Hitler in murdering the Jews. Here's Hitler shaking hands with his buddy Marshal Pétain and with Pierre Laval. So they ran France to the eminent satisfaction of a lot of Frenchmen, and heck with the Jews. There are and there were some noble souls of the Christians. There were some, especially the Protestants, who risked their lives to say, this is true, and you can see the movie Au revoir les enfants. Au revoir les enfants. But most were not like that, okay? Now, so unlike the Jews who immigrated to Britain, the hundreds of thousands, I repeat, the hundreds of thousands of Jews who emigrated to France during the Third Republic misjudged the reality, okay? But they did move there. So if you have two brothers, and this was so typical, and they ran away from Russia in the late 1800s, early 1900s, even in the 1910s and 20s, very often it happened, this brother went to France, and that brother went to England. This guy ended up in Paris, and that guy ended up in London, So let me put it this way. The guy in London made a better choice. That's all I'm saying. The guy in London made a better choice, okay? Now, one more feature of the Third Republic, and this is very important for our story, and that is the Third Republic conquered a huge empire in Africa, okay? Take a look at this. This all was with the French Empire. Look what I'm doing. All these countries before the Second World War. So starting in the 1800s with Algeria, and without boring you with the details, the French conquered a gigantic calic of what we call West Africa, the whole hump. This whole business, okay? Now, the reason I'm mentioning is very large Jewish communities here, here, and here. You've heard of that. Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria. That's a lot of Sephardim. That's a lot of Jews, okay? That's a lot of Jews. And so, as a result, France, on the eve of World War II, had a very large Jewish population. I don't think most people realize it. Look at the numbers. In France, there was 330,000 Jews, of which a huge number were immigrants from Eastern Europe. And in addition, in North Africa, they had over 370,000, which means altogether, you got close to, you have 700,000. That's a big number of Jews, you see? Numbers are funny. Unless you know them, your visions of reality gets distorted. I bet you most people think, France got 50,000 Jews. I'm like, whatever. It's not true. They had a very large Jewish population. Therefore, it's a major center of the diaspora. That's my point. In the 20th century, France has been a major center of the diaspora. Now, by 1945, after Hitler, there were 180,000 Jews in France. So it went from 330 to 180. Okay, those numbers tell you a lot. 75,000 Jews who were French citizens were murdered, plus another 100,000 or so who were not full French citizens living there. Now, on the other hand, after World War II, lots of DPs settled in France, like Elie Wiesel, right? Who lived in France, getting out of the DP camp and came, I forget in what framework, to France and stayed there. So the French population is funny. It's Cabolo and Capolto. They're losing people, they're gaining people, back and forth, all the rest of it. Now, when World War II was over, so was the Third Republic. So they made the Fourth Republic, okay? Which is very similar to the Third Republic. But from the Jewish perspective, I would say, in my opinion, the Fourth Republic was the best for the Jews. That was the best era, if you're looking strictly from the point of view of Klal Yisrael, okay? The Jews perceived it as the Third Republic minus the right and the anti-Semitism associated with the right, which was discredited by World War II and the Vichy regime, okay? And this was the France that helped Israel. The Fourth Republic was Shimon Peres and all the, remember, there was a time where the U.S. would not give Israel any weapons, even though the Russians were giving the Arabs weapons like crazy, and the only country that would give to Israel the weapons was France, especially the high-tech airplanes and things like this. And as a result, it was kind of true. You could see the defense minister of France with Ariel over there, which is, this picture is inconceivable in the Third Republic. You understand? You see a French minister, first of all, in a Jewish state, and second of all, in friendly conversation with a Jewish rabbi, is inconceivable. You get it? And Clemenceau wouldn't do this, right? So the Fourth Republic, because people were coming right off the Holocaust, the leaders of the Fourth Republic were the people who had fought in the resistance. They understood what Nazism was. They were anti-Nazis, and they combined that in their mind with a complete rejection of what we would call today classical anti-Semitism. Okay? So all of a sudden, a person's like this: France is a good place to live if you're Jewish. What's their schlecht? I'm talking about the 40s and the 50s. What's the problem? You see? Now, so all of a sudden, France was a good gullus. As a result, many DPs emigrated to France, and by 1950, it's back to 250,000. So it had been 330,000, now it's back to 250,000. You see, a lot of them were killed. That's why I say, this is not, Baruch Hashem, this is not like America. It's not like Great Britain either. It's like that, okay? That's what I would call an extreme example of galut, you understand? In which it's going back and forth, and I am sure that the Jews are moving there, living there, it's like this. From now on, it's clear sailing. France is going to be just a regular, normal Western European country, and Gamarnum, okay? Then came changes, some good and some bad, okay? First changes were in the 50s and the 60s with the deconstruction of French North Africa, because one of the big stories of the 50s and especially the 60s is France had an empire and then they lost it, okay? Eventually they had to pull out of all those countries in Africa, including the ones with the Jewish population. As a result of what I just described, the population in France, the Jewish population doubled from 250,000 to 500,000 very quickly. That's a big jump. From 250,000 to 500,000, okay? And by natural increase, it went up to 600,000, possibly even 700,000, something like that. Very large numbers. This is the largest Jewish community anywhere outside of Israel and Russia and America, okay? You know, it's Israel, it's Russia, it's America, that's it. Those are the biggies. And then France. England had much fewer, okay? I just want you to, it's not what you imagine. So by this time, they had switched from the Fourth Republic to the Fifth Republic. This is what you call de Gaulle. And the Fourth Republic was too unstable. Every minute was like Israel, you know, coalition, and it's falling on, and it's starting again, falling on, starting again. This guy's the prime minister today, then he's out of office tomorrow, then back again the next day. And so it was too much of a mess. And they had problems with Algeria and all this junk. And so the result is they changed it to what they call the Fifth Republic, in which they have a president, which has big presidential power, more than the president of the United States. A very strong presidency. And they also did something interesting. By the way, a Jewish guy wrote up the Constitution, okay? Michel Debré, okay? He was because de Gaulle, I don't know what he thought about the Jews, but he had a lot of Jews on his staff. Stupid he was not. And there was a guy, Michel Debré, a law professor, and one of the things they said was, we're not going to have this business of 100 parties running. And so in France, they have what you call 2 rounds of elections, which is interesting, which we do not have in this country. If, for example, in our congressional district, 10 guys ran for office, which could happen, or 20, as many as you want, and let's say each guy got, 10%, but one guy got 11%, he's in. Okay, all he needs is plurality. He's in. So if there's 100,000 votes in our district, and this one, you know what I mean, this one gets 10,000, this one gets 10,000, this one gets 10,000, and one guy gets 10,050. So all the others don't count, and he's in. So it's a very, let's put it this way, very not representative, very not stable. And so what they do in France is they say like this: you have round 1 and round 2. Adayom they have this. Round 1, all 10 run. And then round 2, the 2 top guys run. You see? The 2 top guys. That way, one person, by force, will have to have a majority of the votes cast in that district. You see? Even at the level of presidency, it works like that. You have 10 guys running for president, which is a 7-year term in a very powerful office, because it was made for de Gaulle, And if nobody gets 51%, then they have a second round. And the top 2 people who make it to the second round, one of them is going to get the 51%. Has to, you see? So they thought that this would increase the stability in France, which it did to some degree. As far as the Jews are concerned, this happened in 57, 58, by the way. When 57, 58. The last act of the Fourth Republic, I don't know how known this is, the last act of the Fourth Republic, when they had their last cabinet session before they went out of business, they signed the thing to give Israel the A-bomb. That was Shimon Peres' good friend, Bouge Monori. You understand? The last thing, they didn't write those words, but that's what it boiled down to. Okay? Now, that was the Fourth Republic. The Fifth Republic was also friendly to Jews and their rights and their position, thanks to the Shoah, and also thanks to France's reluctance to go into its past. Because the truth of the matter is, the dirty truth is, a lot of Frenchmen liked it under Vichy and didn't mind the German occupation and all the rest of it, and acted very unheroically and didn't give a hoot what happened to the Jews or told on their neighbors all the rest of it. But I don't want to talk about my uncle. I don't want to talk about my grandfather. And I don't want to talk about this politician and that politician who during the war acted very unheroically. For example, Francois Mitterrand, who later on became the president of France. So the deal was like this. We're not going to look too much in the past, but Mikan al-Haba, going forward, we'll be very good on Jewish civil rights and all that kind of stuff. And in return, just shut up. Okay? And the Jews did. Now, it's true that the Fifth Republic was not as friendly to Israel for international reasons. This is why de Gaulle turned on Israel. We know France became an enemy instead of a friend, But I would not say that it translated into anti-Semitism. At the end of the day, unless by anti-Semitism you mean, puff piece. I don't like Jews. I'm not talking, that doesn't count. I mean something real. Even de Gaulle said like this, I think the Jews are an elite dominating race. I consider that a compliment. That's what he said. But be that as it may, if you were Jewish and living in France, even in de Gaulle's time, in the 60s and the 70s, you had complete rights. And, there's no anti-Semitism. And you could walk on the street with a yarmulke. That's my point, okay? Now, the problem with the Fifth Republic, or the problem that came to the Fifth Republic, which happened so often in Gullus, it's such a major feature of Gullus, was the appearance of a completely unexpected factor that changed the game. That, of course, is the Muslim immigration. Now, this was just unforeseen. This is the problem with the Gullus. Everything's great according to this, the way I see it now. But some new thing came out of nowhere, you see? And it couldn't have been foreseen before, and of course, profoundly affected everything. In its unexpectedness, it's sort of like the corona with the small businesses. I mean, you just couldn't know what happening, right? In our own time. Suppose a guy had a small restaurant or something like that. Got hit last year, when they closed everything down with the corona. You couldn't foresee it. That guy's go bankrupt, right? I mean, it's not even his fault. It's not like bad business planning. 5 years ago, he set up a business in Baltimore. It looked like it had a good shot at it. And then this came out of nowhere. The same thing with the Muslim again, came out of nowhere. That's my point. You see, the Fifth Republic decolonized. It was the age of decolonization. So there used to be, as I say before, all that area. Look, they all became countries. This became Algeria, this became Tunisia, Morocco, this became Mali, and all that kind of stuff, right? Countries that most people here don't even know exist, Mauritania, and so forth, the Ivory Coast. So, all right, rather than admit, now let me say it like this, if France would have said, okay, we made a mistake, we're pulling out, but all you guys stay here, don't come to France. That's one thing, but that's not what happened, okay? Rather than admit that what he had been engaging in was old-fashioned colonial exploitation, France claimed that it still maintained deep ties with the African territories because they thought this would be good for the French economy to get a lot of contracts, which they did, and things like that. So they want to make what the British call the British Commonwealth. They want to make like a French Commonwealth, okay? But if that's the case, if we're all happy friends, then all you guys can move into my country, I can move into your country. Ain't that many Frenchmen that want to move en masse into Mali, you understand? There's a heck of a lot of people from Mali that want to move into France. That's what happened, okay? Now, the result is by and large, if you look at these countries, which I say you haven't heard of, with the exception maybe of the Ivory Coast, but that's about it. All the other countries have been failures, okay? They've turned into dictatorships, squalid situations, corruption, the periodic famines, it's the civil wars. This is the way it happened. I mean, more or less from the beginning, okay? So the countries that became independent, mostly, I say the Ivory Coast is an exception, but mostly impoverished, squalid, and oppressive dictatorships. Well, guess what? If I have any kind of education, I have any kind of thing, I'll move to France. If I was an African from these countries, why not? So naturally, most people would emigrate to France, which is a modern first world country. In addition to that, many Arabs in the Arab world, I'm talking about in Egypt and Arabia and Iraq and those places, because the Arab world also was composed of dictatorships with bad economies and all the rest of it. Remember I told you, under Assad, senior and junior, the economy actually contracted. Instead of having economic growth, you had the other way around. Well, that means, especially if I have any kind of education or any kind of ambitions for education, I'm going to go to France. You see? Like that. And so a ton of people moved over there. For its part, the French government welcomed these immigrants for a number of reasons. First of all, they needed workers. Like in America, they let in the Mexicans. That's exactly the attitude they had over there. So these are people, like I say, from Black Africa, from Arab Africa, from the Middle East. The French were confident that the immigrants could be assimilated and Gallicized by France's self-evidently superior culture. Because the French are convinced, as we all know, they're the top of the top, the creme de la creme, and so forth. And they actually believe it. You see? It's one thing if you say it, they actually believe it. So, you pay a penalty, you see? And finally, it was the age, I'm talking about the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. This is the age of political correctness. So the worst thing in the world is to be a racist. Now, what's the result? Look at the numbers. France has 67 million people, which 10% are Muslims. And the numbers are higher when you get to the youth. I'm not going to give you all the figures. Because the French have 1 or 2 kids, and the immigrants are having 10. So what's the future for France? That's my point, okay? Now, I'm interested tonight not in the history of France per se, but in the French Gola, the large Jewish community in France. There's no way that they could have foreseen this, or at least not the average person could have foreseen this, but all of a sudden, the new trend proved disastrous for the Jews in France. How? Why? The main reason has been the big difference between Europe and the Arabs world, in the Muslim world, particularly in the third world countries, as far as the subjects of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. You see, the one good result of the Holocaust in Western culture has been the complete delegitimation of anti-Semitism in Western culture. This became part, to its credit, this became part of modern, civilized, Western European, Western culture. That anti-Semitism is off the books. The Nazis were totally evil. The Holocaust was a unique and frightful, episode. And we have to make sure it can't happen again, like never again, that kind of thing, okay? This has been particularly significant in those European countries where anti-Semitism played a strong role before the rise of Hitler. I mean, countries like France, Germany, Austria, and elsewhere. As I tried to point out before, there used to be a very strong right wing in all these countries, which was democratic countries, which was associated with anti-Semitism. There were parties in the old Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm, long before Hitler, called the Anti-Semitic Party. That was the name of their party. Same thing in Austria. The right-wing parties in France said, if we get into power, we're going to revoke the civil rights of the Jews. You had similar groups operating in other countries in Europe. Belgium, for example, comes to mind, and others, Hungary. And so anti-Semitism was, shall we say, mainstream to some degree. When I say mainstream, I mean, no, you could be that and not lose your standing. But after World War II, that was not the case. And so in the 40s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth, if you're anti-Semitic, you're like, it's a free baby, you're marginalized on the fringes of politics, you're not really anything. And in Europe, as I think you're aware, they actually went so far as to declare Holocaust denial a law, a crime. They legislate against that. This is not true in the United States, where you have freedom of speech. But in European countries, they do not have a tradition of, like we understand constitutionally, sort of almost unlimited freedom of speech. And they do have the right, as they see it in democratically elected societies, to police the state and to declare Holocaust denial off limits, okay? So now you get a whole bunch of Arabs coming in, and Muslims, and people from Islamic Africa, and they say like this: we think the Holocaust was a good idea, and we don't. First of all, it didn't happen. Second of all, the Jews deserved it. You understand? I mean, that's the basic rhetoric. And third of all, why can't we be against the Jews? We think the Jews are terrible. Look what they're doing in Israel, and they're trying to do the same thing here in France. Whatever. In other words, the new immigrants has clashed with the fundamental culture that had prevailed and evolved after 1945 in these European countries. Okay. The complete rejection of anti-Semitism in the wake of the Shoah, as I said before, was reflected in these Holocaust denial laws, in a strong determination to regard anything anti-Jewish as culturally beyond the pale. Even strong opposition to the policies of the State of Israel, which certainly did emerge in many countries in Western Europe, especially after 1967, always was careful to dissociate itself from anti-Semitism. Okay? So all these guys say like this: we think Israel is terrible, Israel maybe should go down the tubes, but we are not against Jews. Because he always had to situate it within that framework. However, the Arabs in the Arab world never bought into the Holocaust narrative. They never condemned Hitler. Actually, the opposite. Sadat, you remember, wrote a fan letter to Hitler when he was alive, and he never really renounced it. And I forget, Sisi is now the head, but the guy next to him has a Tantawi or something like that. His name is Hitler Tantawi. You can Google it. In other words, that means his parents, when he was born, want to give a name that they looked up to. You see? So I'm just trying to show you. And if you ever look at the memory closely, I mean, I'm not requiring everybody to be experts in the Arab culture, but they actually think of Hitler with a ball of cheese. He was a great guy. You understand? Maybe he made a little mistake here and there, but the mistake was not going after the Jews. Maybe he shouldn't have tangled with Russia or something. But they were not going after the Jews. They don't see a problem with that at all. Okay? This is one of the less spoken about disconnects between the culture of the West on the one hand and the culture of the Middle East on the other. Although Arab leaders and spokesmen over the decades took pains to sort of shoot the bull and pay lip service to the Shoah narrative, they never meant it. These Arab leaders and intellectuals and others did so as the price for getting a respectable hearing in the West. But it wasn't sincere. They actually hated the Holocaust narrative because the Holocaust narrative benefited Israel. I would only say that recently, Trump seems like a long time ago, when they had the Abraham Accords, and like for a year, things are flowering, you started to see for the first time in Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and those Gulf states, statements to the effect, the Holocaust was a bad thing. And it meant that as part of the Abraham Accords, they were trying to get the message out to their masses, we should, readjust our past a little bit. You get it? To get in with the new program. That's in the year, 2019 or something like that. So keep that in mind. In spite of all this, the narrative, the Holocaust narrative, was so hardwired into the culture of Western Europe that it dominated that culture throughout the late 20th century. Hence, now I'm not talking about the Arabs, I'm talking about the Christians, Hence, the extraordinary national apologies that popped up in country after country in Europe for what they did during the war, which had been unthinkable in so many of the chauvinistic, proud European cultures of the past. So the head of Germany, you will remember, Willy Brandt, went on hands and knees to apologize, basically, for killing the Jews when he was 1970 at the Warsaw Ghetto. And here's Romania, right? Where the Romanian Hungarian fascists, like in the late 80s, did a ceremony. This is in Klausenburg. Those of you from Klausenburg, right? In Klausenburg. These are the guys that killed the Jews, you know what I mean? They and their friends back in the war. Now, it's a Christian thing, okay? The Christian thing is, you honestly apologize and, you accept the sin and all the rest of it, and you hope in return for forgiveness. It's a Christian idea. It's not a Jewish idea. It's a Christian idea, but it's a Christian country, okay? So I'm trying to say like this. For them, it's very significant. That's my point. For them, it's very significant. Now, believe me, the chief rabbi of Romania, I can imagine what he was thinking. But nevertheless, I don't want to downplay the significance of that either. And the fact you had this all across Europe, and especially after the war was over, the communism fell, you had this in some of the Eastern European countries, is just an interesting example of the fact that, they buy into the Holocaust narrative, even though in Eastern Europe, as I indicated in the past, it's more complicated because they have a funny narrative of their own. But believe you me, if Israel was willing to say to Lithuania and Latvia and all the rest of it, we won't call out your stuff, then they would be very happy to say Chotasi Avisi Pashagti for what we did for the Holocaust. All they want is a little bit of respect for themselves. Even France, which could never find itself capable of ever saying it ever did anything wrong, even France, and this Chalaria Jacques Chirac, who was Mama's a mamzer and a half, what do you call it? He, in 1995, which is 50 years after the end of World War II, correct? 50 years. Even he said we were wrong. Jacques Chirac, the former who died the other day, in July 16, 95, delivered a speech that began a vital reckoning with one of the darkest chapters France's recent history. Of course, 50 years after war, most of the bad people were dead. So you could say it. You get what I'm saying? By 95, most of the perpetrators who cooperated with Vichy either were dead or had one foot on the way out. Okay? Breaking a 50-year taboo and acknowledging France's role in the Holocaust, he said the criminal folly of the occupiers, including the July 1942 roundup in which 45 French police arrested 13,000 Parisian Jews, confining them in crowded and sanitary conditions, sending them to Auschwitz, was seconded by the French and by the French state. In other words, the Germans did it, but we cooperated. And let me put it this way, they couldn't have done it unless the French police cooperated. So that's my point. So now, it's not a full thing, but at least it's saying we did wrong. And this has to do with a very interesting phenomenon, which is there's a guilt in Europe, not for killing Jews, but killing citizens. You understand? If you were a citizen in our country, feel like we betrayed that social contract. You get it? Because if you're a citizen, you're supposed to be protected by the state. You understand? Unless you did something wrong, which they didn't do. How are you going to say children in the Holocaust did something wrong? You get it? Old people and children, you can't do that. So I'm simply saying, look at what's happening in France. On the one hand, you have all these Muslims flowing in. On the other hand, you have this trend of the Holocaust acceptance on the other. So you had a funny situation. On the one hand, France allowed in free Muslim immigration on the understanding that they would assimilate. Such assimilation included, it was expected, no anti-Semitism, as well as respect for the Holocaust narrative. So you guys can come and move to France, but you got to accept the French way of doing things. The French way of doing things is over here, act against the Jews. You see? On the other hand, the immigrants, by and large, didn't follow this. Because they were cheap labor, the immigrants concentrated in what I would call downtown Baltimore's. You understand? In those kind of slum conditions, in which they took over the whole neighborhoods and whole areas of the cities, which of course retarded the assimilation. Okay? Because instead of moving on to French, they all made among each other, and therefore all you see, like it used to be the Lower East Side, East Baltimore, Yiddish signs. So in France, it's all Arab signs. Okay? In America, like I said, the what we would call the phenomenon of the Lower East Side kind of retarded the assimilation. It's not even true. The American Jews who moved here, for better or worse, 100 years ago and 120 years ago, from top to bottom, wanted to assimilate. That doesn't mean that they wanted to necessarily give up their Judaism, but they wanted to Americanize. Let me rephrase that. They wanted to Americanize. Almost nobody in 1900 or 1910, almost nobody was against Americanization. Even the big Rabbanim, they just wanted to do it, have a TA, a Beis Yaakov, something like that. But everybody wanted Americanization. Here in France, you have a different story. Is that they're rejecting that, you understand? Now, at the same time, something else happened, which the French and other Europeans had not foreseen, which is the rise of militant Islam, a frum Islam, which rejects in principle Europeanism and assimilation of the European culture, the way a Satmar Chassid would reject American culture in principle. I said 100 and some years ago, I was talking about the waves of immigration that came here prior to the Second World War. The Satmar Chassidim, for example, came here after the Second War, came in a very different mode. You understand? They're not looking to Americanize. But that's exceptional. The other Jews were looking to Americanize. Just, each one with a different amount of religion that they wanted to retain. In Europe, in France especially, but not only in France, this is true of other countries, but I'm concentrating tonight on France as the largest community. So not only are all these millions of people moving there, but they're becoming more intensely Muslim. And in a way that rejects or sees as betrayal any kind of westernization. And that's not good. In fact, the clergy in the mosques speak until today of the conquest of Europe. Because as I said before, today 6.7 million, and then tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and the day after that has to be a Muslim country, because the majority, plain and simple. This is not what the French had in mind when they let them in. Part of the culture that they're rejecting is the secularity, okay? That's why Osama bin Laden bombed the buildings. He says, I hate the West because they're trying to introduce an atheistic secularity into Islam. Okay? He sees this as a cultural attack. Another part they reject, I repeat, another part that the Muslim immigrants reject is the notion of the toxicity of anti-Semitism and attacking the Holocaust narrative. They do not agree that there's something wrong with speaking about anti-Semitism or being against the Jews. They just don't buy into that, you see? That's why La Maisa, public schools in France are no longer safe for Jewish kids. You have over and over again the following situation. It's in the curriculum to teach about the Holocaust at some point, and France has a central school system with the same, all over the country, as one school district, with orders from the top, from the government, and that's how the French are organized. You know what I mean? The same math book everywhere, the same geography book. So it's the 6th grade, 7th grade, whatever it is, you learn about the Holocaust. The whole class is Muslim, and all the students say, we don't want to learn about this. And the parents say, we don't want to learn about this. And what's the teacher supposed to do? And if the principal don't make the waves, who knows, it'll be a riot. And so what they do is they say, okay, we'll move, still off the record, we'll just move on to something else. You see? This is what I mean by the sociological and demographical reality that we're talking about over here. This is why today, as if my information is correct, most of the Jewish kids in France are going to Jewish schools. Not because all of a sudden they fell in love with Jewish education, because the public schools are bad news in most places. Not everywhere, but most, okay? Now, the same clergy that I talked about before uses hate language in the mosques. You see, when they give a speech all about the Jews, which are not regulated by the state. Even when compelled by the state to refrain from hate speech, they do so only under duress. And so it's clear they don't accept this. So if the preacher, the imam, whatever, gets up and says like this, I can't speak about the Jews today because it's against the law. That itself is a speech. You get it? That itself is a speech. Such a culture, of course, breeds violence. And starting in the 1980s, you can't wear a yarmulke on the street without expecting trouble. This was not the case previously in France. Quite the contrary. I'll say it again, after the war, even before the war, but after the war, if you were Jewish, I don't say they loved you, but they leave you alone. Okay? Which is why, by the way, and this will take too far afield, there was a certain revival among small parts of French Jewry in Yiddishkeit. I think I talked about it in the past with Manitou and the others, because you could do that, you see? Now, in order to fight this, the state and its police forces would have to wage a major struggle, which might trigger riots. And you had riots in France, in the cities, when the Muslim went crazy. This is not Chicago, this is Paris. Remember a couple years ago, 2015, okay? And so, let's put it this way. It means the police would have to invade and conquer the no-go areas in the French cities. They're not so crazy about doing that. So there are whole swaths of French territory which, march to a different drummer. So instead, the regimes in Europe, I'm talking about mainly France, but also other countries, Belgium comes to mind. So instead, the regimes in Europe simply said, we'll provide police protection for the synagogues and for the other mosdos. This was new in Europe, okay? I mean, we're starting, unfortunately, to get that in America. But when I was a kid, and when you were kids, you didn't need police in shoals in Europe, right? Anybody here been in Europe, 50 years ago, something like that? You didn't have any of this kind of stuff, okay? In Germany, you didn't have police protection in the shoals once upon a time. Just like in this country, you never had such a thing. We never heard of it, okay? But it became part of the late 20th century. That's my point. And looking back, my argument tonight is, from perspective of the year 2022, you see the trends. It's not a happy trend, but it's a trend, okay? Now, in other words, the countries were not into solving the problem, because after all, how can you solve it? You can't solve it. And so it became simply part of life that there's going to be random violence against Jews from time to time. That's how it goes. The specific targeting of Jews makes the European violence different from the traditional American urban violence. At least I think so. So what you see in Baltimore, Maryland, elsewhere, that if you go in the wrong neighborhood, you get beat up or killed or something like that. I don't regard this as, it's more like a white-black thing. I don't think it's a Jewish thing, per se, you see? In Europe, it's a Jewish thing. I want you to be clear about that. It's a Jewish thing, okay? Now, it means that starting in the 80s, especially late 80s, France was no longer the unsullied paradise. In addition, the culture of the attackers was one in which they glorified torture and cruelty like they did to Ilan Halimi and the old lady. And if you remember this, and you might not wish to, but here's the old lady, Mariel Knoll. She's a Jewish lady, 85 years old, Holocaust survivor, murdered in 2018. The murder officially described as an anti-Semitic hate crime, which they usually don't do. Two assailants, this guy and this guy, 29-year-old neighbor of Knoll. Now, she suffered from Parkinson's and known her since she was a kid. I mean, you know, she knew him since he's a kid. And the other unemployed 21-year-old. They entered the apartment, they stabbed her 11 times and then set her on fire. This is a glorious thing. Now, the older suspect said, that the younger one said, she's a Jew, she must have money. The two suspects accused each other of stabbing. One claimed the other shouted, Allah Akbar, as he stabbed her. And the Halimi guy, they locked him, remember they put him in a trunk, and the bottom line is they cut him up and burned him and tortured him and this, that, and the other. So it's not simply a hate crime like you shoot somebody or stab somebody. We're not used to this. They like the torture. They like the violence. It's a different culture. You understand? It's a different thing. And so what America call pathological, and it's not pathological, it's a culture. You get it? And this is what we've introduced into France. This is my point, you see? This is what you're in France. And if you're Jewish, by the time your parents moved here or whatever, you thought, oh, it's a great place. And by the time the kids are growing up, what the heck just happened? You see? What the heck just happened? So if you didn't have a policeman or two in front of an elementary school, what would a couple of nuts like this do? He said, what would a couple of nuts like this do? This is how you live, okay? Now, basically what I'm saying is the last 30 or 40 years, wherever there's a Jewish community, they've had to set up some kind of a shomrim, not only in Baltimore, Maryland, everywhere. And this was not the case when I was a kid. It was not the case when you were a kid. There never was a Jewish community that you had to have some kind of security organization or whatever. It used to be called the cops, the police. You understand? I think this started with Mayor Kahane in the 60s, you know, with the JDL and all the rest of it, only in New York. But as you and I know, it's been in our lifetime, it's become universal. I don't think we appreciate the trend unless you look back, as I'm trying to do tonight, and you try to judge, you know, over a period of 30, 40 years, and you see which way the things are going. Our parents did not live in an America like I'm describing, okay? They didn't live with it. You needed a shomrim and a this and that and police in front of the shuls and all the rest of it. It just wasn't in the cards, you see? But now it is, as we all know very well. So what I'm describing is a central historical development of the postmodern era, both in the diaspora as well as in Israel. Because in Israel also, you also have guards in every school. Okay? That's just the way it is. So it's not like you're moving to Israel and here there's no problems whatsoever. The only difference is there are more Jews with guns over there. That's the difference. Okay? Now, so you have a strange situation where the state and the society ban anti-Semitism. They even ban Holocaust denial in France. But large numbers of the residents do it anyway, and the state does not punish them. Passing a law and not enforcing it is a terrible thing for a political state because it calls the entire state into question. Okay? What France and the others have done, therefore, is, first of all, deny it's a long-term problem. It's really a short-term problem. They will produce what I call tame Muslim clergy. You have a few guys that are moderates or whatever. and they'll say the right things. Oh, we're against hate, we're against me, and all the rest of it. Then you can claim it's just a matter of time until this level of enlightenment reaches the rest of the Muslim population. Therefore, just wait it out. Yeah, right. The second thing you can do is blame the victims. So you say it's actually the fault of Israel's occupation of Arab land and suppression of Palestinians. So don't expect France to solve that problem. The third one is simply to deny it like they do in Baltimore. Play funny math, right? It wasn't a hate crime. It didn't happen. If it did happen, it was for some other reason, and blah, blah, blah. This Ilan Halimi, it's all depressing. There's all these Jewish Frenchmen who were killed and murdered. The police wouldn't treat it as a crime, and certainly not as an anti-Semitic crime, and hate crime, and this and they played that kind of a game. So then you fudge the statistics. In addition to threatening the personal physical security of the French Jews, there was now an ever-increasing bloc of Muslim voters who want France and its government to pursue anti-Israel policies. This added to an existing anti-Israeli bloc motivated by, number one, the desire to curb favor with the French states. In other words, the old-fashioned French diplomats, the Quai d'Orsay. They say there's a lot more Arabs than there are Jews, so let's start with the Arabs. And number two, you have all these leftist PC types in France and other European countries, basically the Jeremy Corbyn phenomenon, okay? Which they have in France and other places. And then there were the pogroms that became part of every Israeli war. So this became simply part of the way life is in France and the rest of Europe. And America, I might say. If there's a war in the Middle East, you have a spillover here. So we saw it in America. What, didn't they bust into Manhattan and in LA and places like that? And in other words, I have the right to kill you because the Israelis are bombing Gaza. So I have the right to kill you here in Baltimore, Maryland, or Washington, D.C., or New York, or something like that. And may I say, the state doesn't really interfere. The state does not interfere. Okay. Now, in addition to all this, the existence of a large minority in France which defiantly displayed anti-Semitism had the effect of making nativist European anti-Semitism what they call in the Gemara, choser v'nir, have a revival, okay? Have a revival. But here it's very complicated. Ever since 1945, the kind of nativist anti-Semitism had been radically marginalized, as I said before, because of the Vichy. Only civilized right-wing sentiment has been kosher. So Charles de Gaulle would be a good example. He was a right-winger, but not anti-Semitic at all. Get it? Not in his country, okay? He's in favor of full civil rights for everybody. But that doesn't mean anti-Semitism wasn't there among broad swaths of the French population. It just wasn't activated, but it was there. And now it was and is currently being constantly stimulated by the anti-Semitic rhetoric and messages constantly emerging from the Muslim population. So, and this is true in the United States also. There's so much junk on the internet. It's okay for people, you see it all the time, every day, every week. Somebody says something that you wouldn't imagine people would have said. I mean, senators, congressmen, this, that, and the other. You wouldn't imagine they would have said when we were young, okay? Now, the weird thing, of course, is that the right-wingers realize that the real danger to France is not from the Jews, but precisely from the Muslims, the ones generating this. So that's what makes it so like a pretzel, you see? They're hearing all the right kind of anti-Semitic stuff, but then they say to themselves, wait a minute, these guys are a bigger danger to us because they could take over. And indeed, the main thrust of strong right-wing politics in France has been anti-Arab and anti-Muslim, not so much directed against Jews, which is kind of strange. However, as we all know, and here comes that business with the diaspora, things out of left field, opposition to foreigners who are not truly French, which is the basic tenet of the right, can easily spill over into regarding Jews the same way in the sense of collateral damage. And so if you look at Jean-Marie Le Pen, who's always been the big right-wing leader, let's put it this way. His main thing is against the Arabs. But he always said like this, Holocaust wasn't that big of a deal, There's a couple ovens, it's like a bakery, and, enough already. That kind of talk. Now, in addition, by the way, his daughter kicked him out of the party, took over. She says, we don't talk like that. But you don't know the next person coming along. To be a right-winger means you subscribe to a different Holocaust narrative one that does not make France look so bad. And there are a lot of people, I hate to say this, but World War II was a long time ago. And the way things go, there's always revisionism. And we're living in a time when you take my word for it, I hope I'm wrong. You're going to people say, like, hey, no, there's good points. It wasn't that bad. I mean, he did some bad things, like that. But yeah, he had some good points. That's the kind of thing you see in certain quarters and in France also. The Holocaust was bad, of course, but it wasn't the only central sort of thing. A lot of other people were killed in World War II, And anyway, how could they kill 6 million if you do the math? It doesn't work out. That kind of rhetoric. So it's at least a borderline Holocaust denial, or at least resentment of the constant emphasis of the Jewish narrative. Like I said before, plenty of others. The Poles got murdered in the war, and the Hungarians got murdered in the war, and this and that and the other. 6 million Germans died in the war. You can talk like that. You see? 6 million Germans died in the war. Actually, 6 million soldiers died in the war, another 2 million. So it's 6 million, that kind of language gets out there. It's like the Baltic states that I mentioned last year, where, the Jews had it bad, but we had it bad too, It's like fans of Robert E. Lee in this country, you understand? He did some bad things. He also did some good things. Now, so far in France, the right wing is not one power, but you never know. Indeed, the thesis that liberalism, which advocates for unlimited immigration, is a mortal threat is a cogent thesis, certainly in Europe, okay? The liberals in this country have made an article of faith that you have to be in favor of unlimited immigration, which is crazy, you understand? But, oh no, if you say it, it's politically correct. So the question is, how will French Jews fare in all this, which involves megatrends out of their control, but which definitely buffets them? The French are nuts. The French political situation is nuts, and therefore, you have the most unexpected businesses. The newest iteration is this guy, right? He's the Jewish Rush Limbaugh, and he's now the #1 presidential candidate for the right, okay? And he's a graduate of TA, or the Paris version of TA, went to École Yavne, okay? So you could have, well, that's like the TA over there. So you could have, it's possible, because his numbers are up at the moment, the next president of France could be, #1, a Jewish guy, Tunisian, right? #1, a Jewish guy. #2, a day school graduate. Let me put it this way. He knows what shop is. I don't say keep shop, but he has a Jewish education. And he could be emerged as one of the right wing, which is crazy, okay? Imagine a day school graduate as president of France. The hour is late, and I've ended up concentrating on France, which is the largest diaspora. Look, how was I supposed to know the Russians would invade the Ukraine 2 days ago? As we've seen, the long-term trend in the diaspora is to spit out the Jews, usually, interestingly, as a result of an unforeseen megatrend. That's basically my thesis tonight. I just chose the example of France, okay? If I wanted to concentrate in America, I could make a similar argument. I hope I'm wrong, but that's what happens. Unforeseen megatrends. Now, from a religious point of view, you could say it's good. All Jews should go to Israel. From a secular perspective, you raise the following question. Is Israel safe without a diaspora? Right? Is Israel safe if there's no America to help them? Now, it's an interesting question to raise. It's a tricky question. You can't be simplistic about it. On that complex note, I say to you good night.